Doing awesome.
Uh, all right, so we are going to get started. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. My name is Katie McDonald. I'm the Director of Operations for Miles for Migraine. I think we've got a mix of people on the event tonight. Some people have been to a Miles for Migraine event in the past, and some have not. Um, so I wanted to just share a little bit about who we are and why we exist. We're a national nonprofit organization committed to improving the lives of people living with migraine and headache disease. A lot of people who have initially heard of Miles for Migraine know of us because we put on walk, run, relax events all around the country. We put those events on in cities that have headache fellowship programs, programs teaching doctors their specialty training, doctors going through specialty training to become headache specialists. And as many of you on the event tonight know, there's a severe shortage of headache specialists. So Miles for Migraine uses these walk, run, relax events as an opportunity to raise awareness about migraine and headache disease, but also to raise funds to support those headache fellowship programs and the research that the fellows are doing, support their education, et cetera. In addition to these walk, run, relax events, though, we offer a lot of other programming that may be a little less well known. We have events like this, which we call our social series, where we bring people together to learn different things or do fun things like art therapy. Um, we have support groups that are offered virtually 6 days out of the week. You can join on Zoom. You can pop in once. You can come. We've got people who've been coming weekly for several years. So whatever suits your needs. We do education events where we bring in various speakers to talk about the latest treatment options. We've actually got one coming up later this month that'll be based in Denver and also be held online as a hybrid format. We have programming for youth and parents. We have a mindfulness series where we do the things like yoga and art therapy. So lots of different programs. And it's all about creating community and helping people living with migraine and headache disease feel more supported. This event tonight, we're really excited about. There has been not a lot of research about migraine and headache disease. And over the past few years, I think advocacy uh, has grown a lot in our migraine space. And with that, there's been the introduction of a lot of new books about migraine and headache disease. And we thought it would be fun to bring together some authors of some recent books so that they can share with you a little bit about what their book is about, why they chose to write it, and maybe spark interest for you and something new for you to check out. So we are going to do the style for tonight is I'm going to introduce each of the speakers. I'm going to introduce a speaker, and then they're going to share a little bit about their book, and then I'll introduce the next speaker. Each one will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end. So you can put your questions into the chat if you'd like. We'll answer those at the end. And then at the very end, we will do a raffle to give away one of each of these books to folks who are present tonight. Sound good? All right, bear with me for 1 second. Okay, so our first presenter tonight is Dr. Joanna Kempner. Dr. Kempner is an associate professor of sociology at Rutgers University, where she studies science, medicine, and inequality. Her work on health and justice, stigma in medicine, and the political suppression of science attempts to give a voice to those we rarely hear from. Her writing addresses the lack of effective treatments for pain, gender, race, and stigma, and the extraordinary lengths that people will go to in order to find relief. She is the author of the award-winning book, Not Tonight, Migraine and the Politics and Gender, Migraine and the Politics of Gender and Health, and most recently, Psychedelic Outlaws. Her research can also be read in a wide range of academic and popular publications, including Science, Social Science and Medicine, and Migraine.com. And tonight, Dr. Kempner is going to talk to us primarily about her most recent book, Psychedelic Outlaws. I'll turn it over to you, Joanna.
Hi, Katie. It's good to see you. And it's good to be back at Miles for Migraine events. I love you guys. Here's my new book. So you can get it. I think it's cheapest on Amazon, but you can find it lots of different places. Like Katie said, I'm a sociologist at Rutgers. And it would be great if I'm on a new iPad and I don't know how to turn off the messages. I'm really sorry. I'm still trying to work this machine out. So I don't know if you can hear that or not, but I'm sorry if you can. So I've been working in the world of headache for a while. And some of you may know me from Not Tonight, which is a book about migraine, its history and stigma, and the ways which medicine fails to take pain seriously. And I was pretty sure that I was going to move away from migraine and pain after that. But when I was doing that work, I met Bob Wold from Cluster Busters. I knew that this was a while back, and I knew there were people in cluster headache who were using psilocybin, but I didn't really know very much about them. And I met them in Headache on the Hill back in 2012. And it was the first time I really spent any time with people with cluster headache. And I didn't really, even though I have chronic migraine, I didn't really know how serious it was. And I mean, even though I had studied so much about cluster headache, it's really different to kind of confront cluster headache. Now the group, if you don't know them already, they call themselves Cluster Busters. And the cluster headache really is, I mean, I've had a migraine pretty much nonstop since the beginning of June. And cluster headache is a different kind of headache. It's shorter, it's very severe. And it's hard to compare pain. I will say that. But Tom Zeller, who's here, can tell you a little bit about cluster headache. I don't want to take away from his time, though. But in that meeting in 2012, I met somebody with cluster headache who had told me that he had never slept more than 90 minutes at a time because REM cycles were waking him up. They were triggering the attacks. And it would wake him up with like a kind of shock. And the pain was so severe. He was like trying to bang out the pain. People were trying to pass out, but they couldn't pass out. Their body just wouldn't let them. And it's a condition that drives so many people to despair, very high rates of suicidal ideation and so forth. But what I found made their story so extraordinary wasn't the severity of the pain, but what they had done about it. So right now we're experiencing very high levels of political suppression of science. I had been studying that under the George W. Bush administration. And between that and studying the lack of research on migraine, I was getting pretty depressed. So when I met Cluster Busters and I saw this group of patients, I thought rather heroically doing the work that they needed to do, not saying no. Like I saw these headache doctors being like, oh, there's no funding to do the work I think is important. But I saw these headache patients, they discovered that psilocybin could treat their pain. And they weren't talking about how it was illegal. They weren't talking about how they didn't have any funding. They were just doing the research. And I was like, this is a model of resistance. And I needed that kind of optimism in my life. And they weren't like Timothy Leary kind of people or countercultural rebels. They were regular old people like construction workers and nurses and teachers and parents and grandparents. They didn't have an interest in being outlaws, but they needed to survive and they were going to do what it took to do it. So that's what the book is about. I wrote it as a narrative nonfiction, so I hope it reads well. I hope it reads as much like fiction as possible, although it's kind of stranger than fiction. And they came up with protocols that anybody could use, go online and use the treatment that they discovered. And they brought it as early as 2006 to Yale and to Harvard and eventually to Yale. So that was years before we were hearing about psychedelic medicine on the news. So I followed them for over a decade. I read like millions of pages of their online forums, and I went to their homes and interviewed them, and I found a group of heroes. And I don't think we have enough stories about heroes in the migraine community. Ordinary people doing extraordinary science in the shadows of drug prohibition. they're really like the OGs in the psychedelic world, and they don't really get the credit that they should. So I followed these characters. Some of you may know Bob Old. I followed Flash. I traced this back, and it goes into the history of psychedelics as well. And also, I talk about like I use them as a way in to really understand what's wrong with drug regulation, what's wrong with what randomized controlled trials don't allow us to know. And ultimately, I hope you find it's a story about justice, resilience, and the will to survive. I hear from a lot of people, like, I mean, it's a story about a relatively rare condition, but I think that if you are a person who experiences a lot of pain and you've had to figure out your own way through medicine, I think it's a resonant story. I mean, they resonated with me anyway. I mean, I definitely have a closet full of treatments that I've been trying, and they're still working on it, right? It doesn't work for everyone, but it's another tool in the kit. And they're working on it for migraine now, and I hope people like it.
Fantastic. Do you want to, since you've got a few more minutes, do you want to speak briefly about Not Tonight? Because that book is also still very popular.
Yeah. Not Tonight is a story about it's not a story. I have had migraine since I was a little girl, and my mom had migraine, and my dad has migraine, and my grandparents have migraine. And I wanted to understand, and I started doing this research in 2001. I wanted to understand why a disease that was so prevalent and disabling and so costly got so little attention. For sociologists, that's a really important puzzle. Why are the issues we pay attention to not necessarily the issues that are causing the most burden in society, and vice versa? Why is an issue that causes so much burden not getting any attention? And so I trace that through time, and I come around. At the time, I called it legitimacy. It's trying to disentangle the what's gender, what's legitimacy, and what's stigma is kind of an interesting, for me, sociological puzzle as well. But it really comes down to like gender and stigma, and the kind of institutionalized stigma around migraine. People don't take it seriously, and trying to figure out how much of that is because we don't look at migraine as a regular disease. We think of it as a moral quality that people have, right? Like you're not just a person with migraine, you're a person who might be weak, seen as weak or neurotic, as sensitive as somebody who just doesn't fight through the pain. And as anybody who has headache disorders know, you're fighting through the pain most of the time. Um, that's most of what you do. And so it's kind of like a wake up call to like know that most of the time, like when you show your pain, people think that's what you are doing all the time, but that's actually you at your worst, right? So yeah, so I trace where that idea comes from in that book. So it's kind of like for Psychedelic Outlaws, it's kind of the flip side. I wanted to really show people, I think people in pain are heroic most of the time, and we don't see all the tricks. I think we're always developing tricks and hacks and ways of being in the world and ways of managing the world. And the reason why Miles for Migraine is such an important community is because we can share with each other these ways of living with a disease. Psychedelic Outlaws is that story, but I was hoping it was just that kind of story that would capture people's imaginations, like a broader public's imagination, just because magic mushrooms are a little sexier.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Joanna. And if folks have questions for her, we can address those a little bit later in the session tonight. But I appreciate you sharing about both of your books. They're both fantastic. Next, we have Lisa Benson. Lisa is a sculptor, writer, and advocate for migraine awareness. She cares about awareness since she was undiagnosed for over 20 years, which resulted in her migraine worsening over time. Finally diagnosed in 2011 and living with chronic migraine, she worked hard to educate herself and navigate the medical world to find effective treatment for her condition, though this is ever changing. She has 10 plus years of experience as a professional sculptor at Skylight Studios and the Caproni Collection, and has written over 100 articles on migraine.com. For advocacy, she's presented at Retreat Migraine and volunteers for Headache on the Hill and Miles for Migraine. And Lisa is going to talk to us about a special project she did during Miles for Migraine's Act Now advocacy training program. Take it away, Lisa.
Thanks, Katie. And that was awesome, Joanna. I can't wait to read Psychedelic Outlaws. So just show you all the book, Dear Migraine. And I want to sort of talk about the seed of this book because it started, Act Now is what enabled me to do it. But the seed of it started um, about like a little over 10 years ago when I was studying sculpture in grad school. And on Christmas morning, I woke up with a migraine that was the worst migraine of my life, and it didn't go away. And I ended up having chronic migraine for that was starting while I was trying to finish up my graduate work. And it was really lonely. And as an artist and a creative person, like, I'd find little scraps of paper and write super emo poems about my experience on them. And, that kept me company. But really at that time, I was yearning for our, not just my voice, but our voices to be heard. And I didn't see a lot of it back then. Um, and as I got more involved in the migraine community, I saw and heard a lot more of our stories. And each story is unique and different. But there's, a through line through all of them where we all have um, that face we have to put onto the world, despite how we're feeling. And there's always a search for understanding, a search for hope of maybe having a treatment that will help. And, um, so that seed stayed and was starting to grow. And then Miles for Migraine reached out and said, we're starting this program, the Act Now advocacy training program. And I joined it. And during the program, we learned, they were saying we would like all of you to think of an advocacy project. So I brought the idea of a book to Miles for Migraine. And I'm not sure if you all initially thought it was going to happen. But, in working with everyone who would come to, because I did some of the mindfulness events, some of those events, people had a lot to say and had a lot of creativity, even if they previously never, say, wrote a poem or, whatever kind of expression. So we got 64 contributors to the book, and it took about 2 years. The Miles for Migraine team was a big help in editing the book and helping me figure out how to even get it published. And so it was a group effort. Because of that, I would like to read one poem and then show two other pages of the book. The poem is called Solitude's Dream by Amanda Workman. The days crawl by, and every day I see a different face in the mirror. One who is there, yet far off in some little place, lost in many thoughts that freely roam. A thought comes to mind, causing me to slightly wonder why I go through this daily routine of painting on a mask so the world cannot see my pain. I continue to fix my makeup, trying so desperately to hide the proof of sleep deprivation and chronic migraine. The mirror shows a woman who craves freedom from an invisible disease. The prodrome wave passed by, and the migraine crashes into me. An overwhelming feeling of sadness and desperation initiates my trail back to bed, back to the comfort and shelter within, while I tightly hold my pillow and pray that I can drift off into some distant, pain-free dream. And so a little bit like Joanna was saying, how people, you know, don't realize that we're always pushing through on some level. I feel like if people can read um, this compilation, they could maybe understand a little bit better the daily experience. Um, this is a pair of paintings I'm about to show by a woman named Jennifer Donlevy. It's a self-portrait with migraine is the first painting, and then this is the self-portrait when she's feeling well. So hold it back for the contrast. And then one more, a mother-daughter team wrote a couple haiku, and they also sent in their photo. And I just love that you get to see their actual faces. These are people you could pass on the street, not think anything about them. And you just never know who has migraine. The first haiku. Oh, and their names are Jakira Stevens and C. Stevens. One, it is the monster. I want to get rid of it, this darkness inside. Two, not everyone knows just how bad the pain can be. This torture scares me. Three, purple, red, purple. We will highlight during June migraine awareness. So yeah, I hope this book has and will help many people to understand um, to understand our world. I hope it brings comfort to people, who are dealing with maybe a bad day, a bad year, a bad decade. Um, I also want to point out all the proceeds go to Miles for Migraine. So you're supporting back to the community if you do buy the book. Um, so yeah, that's about it.
That's great. Thank you so much, Lisa. And to your point earlier, when you brought up the idea of doing a book, yes, we were a little like, really? You think you're going to pull this off? Okay, all right, let's see if it works out. And you put in a tremendous amount of work with the whole community. So great job with that. And then the other thing I just wanted to say, you pointed out that the book is helpful for helping other people understand what migraine is about, but I think it's equally helpful for people living with migraine. It's so relatable as you start reading and looking at the artwork. So much of what you see, you'll be like, oh, exactly, yes. Like that's a great way to explain it. So it serves dual purpose, I think.
Yeah,
Um,
I
Go
enjoyed
ahead.
that a bit. Yeah, no, I just am agreeing. I just want to read Mara's comment, if that's okay.
Yeah.
She said, I so relate to that. The visual depiction is powerful. Thank you for showing the artwork.
Yes. Thank you. And another thing to point out, Lisa is doing another writing workshop in beginning of November, November 2nd. We'll drop the link for that into the chat if anyone's interested in joining. It's a it's just a fun experience. It's good to let go and just practice writing creatively. Even if you think you aren't a writer, you can enjoy that event. So thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Next up, we have Tom Zeller Jr. Tom is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Undark, a nonprofit digital magazine exploring the intersection of science and society. Previously, he was a reporter and columnist at the New York Times, an editor at large for National Geographic magazine, and a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He lives in Lolo, Montana, and The Headache is his first book. All right, Tom.
Yeah, thank you for that, Katie. And hi, everyone. It's good to see some folks I know. It's good to meet folks that I haven't met before. And I'm just delighted to be here. Again, I'm Tom Zeller. As Katie already mentioned, I've spent most of my adult life as a working journalist, the largest part of that at the New York Times, where I covered a variety of topics, mostly sciencey type stuff like climate change and energy development and the environment, but also a little technology and business and politics. I was sort of a jack of all trades there, I guess. And then more recently, yeah, I've been working as the founding editor and chief of Undark Magazine, which is a digital science magazine based at MIT. If you haven't seen it, check it out. We're doing good stuff. But the project that brings me here is a little different. I might even say a lot different. Um, and it started in a very personal place, the sort of place that I was not accustomed to writing about as a journalist, and that's headache disorders. And in my case, the motivation was cluster headache, as Joanna mentioned, which I first developed in my early 20s. It's rare, far more rare than migraine, but the attacks are brutal, sometimes referred to even in the scientific literature as suicide headache. But I think that as Joanna mentioned, it's impossible for us to compare pain, but all I can say is that, the moniker might give you a sense of the intensity of the attacks. They're more short-lived than migraine, but the intensity is quite high. And back when I first started experiencing them, I did what I think a lot of headache sufferers do, or at least I do, and that's in the moments when I was able, I started reading everything that I could find on the topic to get a sense of what might be going on inside my head. Not because I was investigating it for any sort of public purpose, but just because it meant something to me to try to know, just to understand. Even if I couldn't stop the pain, if I knew what it was, that could help somehow. And I also wanted to know what doctors and scientists might be doing to get to the bottom of these and related disorders. I went on in my career, not as gracefully as I might have hoped with these headaches, but for the most part, I kept the condition to myself. Obviously, some close friends and family knew. It's not an easy thing to hide when a cluster headache is happening, but it was not something that I wanted to dwell on or make public in my professional life. So I mostly kept it in the shadows. And using a combination of sick time and working from home, so that my struggles with cluster headache remained very much a private thing. Uh, but in my quiet hours of reading and digging through the scientific literature, I just kept noticing this remarkable gap that Joanna mentioned and other folks have mentioned. This sort of irreconcilable gap between our understanding of headache disorders and scientific interest in the topic and how little we actually knew, which was really baffling to me. I understood that cluster headache was rare and that it wasn't something that was necessarily going to attract a lot of dollars and attention. But headache disorders writ large, including migraine, are so widespread, with more than 1 billion people around the world experiencing one form or another. And yet, compared to other diseases with fewer sufferers, headache disorders seem to get a fraction of the funding, a fraction of the research. And as I think we can all attest, and some of my fellow authors have made more eloquently clear than I could, they get very little cultural respect. It's just a headache, right? We've heard that so often. So that was really the motivation behind the book when I finally decided I was going to do it, was to take this thing that had been both personally haunting and as invisible as I could make it, and put it under the light, interrogate it journalistically, to take the same investigative lens that I'd used in so many other topics in my career and turn it on myself and on the wider world of headache disorders and try to make sense of how those disorders manifest within the scientific community, among clinicians, and in the wider culture. So I guess in the headache, and I was not clever enough to bring a copy like some of my co-panelists, so I can't show it to you. Uh, um, in the headache, I guess I try to do three things, which is explain as best I can from a journalistic perspective and make it accessible to the average reader. What does science know and what does science not know about how these disorders work? To trace some of the cultural history that's shaped how we see and dismiss headache disorders, and to tell the very human stories of people living with them, myself included. Um, I should say that I don't think the book is entirely about pain, and that was deliberate. Um, I think it's more of a book about how science tends to confront things it doesn't understand, how science confronts mysteries. It's about, as Joanna mentioned, bias and blind spots, and how those creep into research priorities, and how whole populations can end up being underserved along the way. Um, and it's a lot about empathy and about learning to recognize and see forms of suffering that don't have a scar or a visible wound, but that can still completely alter the trajectory of someone's life. So I guess if there were takeaways that I hope that people have from the book, one, on the one hand, I hope readers would come away with a sense of the biology such that we currently understand it. But I try to make it fun and accessible and sort of, it's a little bit of a whodunit. Um, and these debates are important in science. Not everybody agrees what's happening in the head, and some of the debates among scientists, I think, are pretty entertaining. Um, and I also hope that readers would leave with a new appreciation for how society decides what kinds of suffering matter, and whose pain gets taken seriously, because those questions echo, as we all know, far beyond headache disorders. So, yeah, I wanted to write a book that was accessible, to do it to do a journalistic project, which I hadn't seen a lot of, and to bring dignity to the subject again, and also inviting people who might not have thought twice about headaches or who've even experienced them take an interest, because the body and the brain and our anatomies are weird, wild stuff. So I hope it's a good ride in that regard too. Um, yeah, and I hope you'll find it fascinating.
I'm probably 2/3 of the way through it right now, Tom. I do appreciate that there's a nice mix of some like history behind a
Mm,
lot of the stuff that's happened and the personal stories too. For folks online tonight, one of the stories that I feel like a lot of people don't know a lot about, but we should better understand is, when the release of the CGRPs in 2018, and what a long, long process that was,
yeah.
to get, those drugs, which are, you know, monumental for our community.
Hmm.
The how long, decades that it took for them to be able to come to fruition. And Tom talks about that in the book,
Yeah.
which is really interesting.
And it's, I mean, in some ways that's science. Science is a lot of sort of wrong turns and failures and learning from failures, but a lot of it is people and a lot of it is culture too. And, I think a lot of the scientists that I speak to and a lot of the advocates I speak to are right in suspecting that we might be much further along had certain sort of cultural biases not been at work. And so while these drugs are a great miracle, um, they took far too long to arrive in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing a bit about your book. And I think your
Yeah,
your book
thank you.
is hottest off the press of all of them tonight. So
It's about
congratulations.
a month and a half. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
And thanks for having me.
of course. All right. Next, we have Jaime Sanders. Jaime is an author and blogger dedicated to advocating for individuals living with invisible illnesses, with a particular focus on headache and migraine. Drawing from her personal experiences, she works to raise awareness and foster understanding about these often debilitating conditions. Through her writing, she provides support and resources for those affected, helping to amplify their voices and build a sense of community. Jaime's journey into advocacy began with her own struggles with chronic migraine, giving her firsthand insight into the challenges faced by others with similar conditions. By sharing both her story and the stories of others, she aims to empower individuals navigating life with invisible illnesses and inspire greater empathy and action across society. Take it away, Jaime.
Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you for having me here. I'm just so honored to be among everyone, and their great work. It's just a great privilege to be here, so thank you. Again, my name is Jaime Sanders. I am a lifelong migraine patient. I've had migraine my entire life, and it's definitely shaped who I am as a person, and definitely created this world of advocacy that I live in now. It's definitely shaped the way that I perceive myself and my disease, and it's taught me so many lessons along the way. And it's led me to want to share those lessons with those who are willing to listen, um, to be able to be better advocates for themselves, to be able to show up in life the way that they always wanted to, despite having a headache or migraine diagnosis, and to be fulfilled in who they are, despite having such debilitating and disabling illnesses. So the book really is an extension of my blog, The Migraine Diva. And I started my blog in 2011. And the point of the blog was to create a community around myself because although I had great support with my family and friends around me, I did not know anybody living with chronic migraine. And it was a very isolating, lonely place to be. And I wanted to share my story, not only to bring awareness to what life is like living with such a debilitating headache disorder, but also to help break down the stigma behind migraine disease, by showing exactly what it looks like in real life, in real time, and what that means for an individual living with this disease, how it impacts their family, and just the trajectory of their life. Migraine can be a thief many times. It can steal your dreams and aspirations. It can steal your goals. It can steal the way that you view yourself. Unfortunately, I think with migraine and headache disorders, we tend to personify our symptoms. And like Joanna said, it's become more of like a moral flaw to have migraine or a headache disease, instead of looking at the real biology behind it and what is causing this for people. And so that was an important lesson for me to learn. And what this book does is it just brings you through my journey of being diagnosed with migraine as a little girl at 8 years old and what that was like for me, shining a light on pediatric and adolescent migraine and what that looks like from a child's view. Even though I'm writing about it from an adult perspective at this point in my life, I still very much feel like that little 8-year-old every time I suffer through a migraine attack. That has never changed for me. The severity, the isolation, and the debilitation of it all. It just really harkens back to that time of being a little girl, just unknowingly going through this suffering, with not that much support medically for her, which was, it's very sad. But it's important that we shine a light on that as well. And I just go through what life is like for a young person living with migraine and having to grow up in this environment of stigma and how that really impacts a person's ability to grow up in this disease and how that impacts the way that they see themselves as an adult and how they show up as an adult. And so the motivation for this book is just really to highlight day-to-day life with chronic migraine and how that looks for anybody living with this disease who is somebody that wants to be able to fulfill their goals at work, who wants to have a family, and wants to be able to show up fully in life as the individual that they feel like they are, but migraine or headache is taking that from them. I touch on so many different aspects in this book as well, how to support yourself and build a support system around you. What does that look like? Navigating, talking to your children, if you have young kids and you're going through this debilitating disease, how do you speak to your children about that? How do they understand, what others foresee as your limitations, but I see them as my superpower. I'm a different kind of mom because I have migraine disease. I feel like because of my disease, I'm a bit more empathetic and more sympathetic. And there's a lot of compassion there, and I'm able to pass that on to my children by exhibiting that type of personality and behavior around them. I also touch on the different biases that play a role in why navigating the healthcare system and getting a diagnosis and getting proper treatment is really, these huge barriers that people face on a day-to-day basis, trying to mitigate their disease and how to manage that. And it just really is an important, I think, testimony to how far I've come personally with my disease, and really just showing how resilient and how strong everyone living with a headache or migraine diagnosis really are. We're, I think, some of the strongest, most capable people that walk across this planet. I think we're some of the most creative and the most brightest, but unfortunately it's dimmed down. And I think what this book shows everyone is not to dim your light. You have a bright light and you deserve to shine. And it's taken me all these years of living with this disease to find out that my light deserves to shine. And I think everybody deserves to feel that level of empowerment, of appreciation, of understanding, of not feeling judged, and just that compassion and empathy. And I think you come away feeling stronger. I feel like what this book does is it validates your experience, because as I read it and I reread my book from time to time, and I'm just like, Tom, I didn't think of bringing my book with me. So I'm in the middle of like a severe migraine attack as well. So it's like my brain isn't functioning that great. But I feel like what the book represents as a whole is just a representation of just the strong, just nature and the ability to feel so empowered within your life of living with this disease. It's important that you understand that you are still, full of value, and you're full of light, and you're deserving of love and respect. And what this journey has taught me, not only in being a better advocate for myself, and really standing as a powerful individual in the trajectory of my healthcare, and really finding that my relationships with my clinicians and my medical team is a partnership and not a dictatorship. That lesson was very important for me to learn. I feel like what this book can do is teach that to other people as well. You have a voice. Your disease is legitimate. Your experiences are valid. And there are tons and tons of support around you to help you navigate through not just the healthcare system and how to navigate getting the proper care and treatment and managing your disease, but it's support as well, like Miles for Migraine, and everything that they do for our community is so transcendental, and it really does make life with this disease a lot easier when you have the support that Miles for Migraine brings and gives to people. So I appreciate you highlighting my work and allowing me to share my story. And I'm just so grateful for anyone that's willing to read and listen, and just be a part of this journey with me. So thank you. And I'm sorry if I was rambling. My brain is like on another scale tonight.
You were not rambling. You spoke very clearly, especially knowing you're dealing with an attack. I know a couple of us here tonight are in that space, so I really appreciate you still being here despite that. Your book, I think, is you said the word, it's validating. I think it's a great resource, especially for people who are maybe newly diagnosed or new into seeking information about what they're going through. You're very vulnerable. You allowed yourself to be vulnerable and sharing your personal story, but I think that's so important in our community for helping people to feel less alone. You offer a lot of tips on self-care and managing your care. So definitely recommend this for anyone, not just those newly diagnosed, but maybe especially resonate for those folks. So thank you for sharing your story and for putting the time into turning it into a book, Jaime. Greatly appreciate that.
Thank you.
All right, last but not least, we have Dr. Egilius Spierings. He's a neurologist with specialty training in the diagnosis and treatment of headache and face pain. He's also a pharmacologist with extensive experience in the development of migraine medications. He was an associate clinical professor of neurology at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, and a clinical professor of neurology and craniofacial pain at Tufts University Schools of Medicine and Dental Medicine in Boston. He is currently the medical director of the Greater Boston Headache Center at Boston Advanced Medicine in Waltham, Massachusetts. Dr. Spierings.
Thank you very much for having me. I do have a copy of my book that I can show. I just happen to have it lying on my desk here, so I thought I might as well show it. I'm very touched by what I've heard tonight. What really resonates to me is what Jaime said, in the sense that you need to have a voice to get good care or to receive good care. And that is probably the most important reason why I wrote the book, Headaches, Why You Have Them, What You Can Do About Them. I have written about a dozen books or so, although directed towards the medical profession. This is the first book I have written for the patient, really, or the broader audience. The one thing that got me to do this, go away from writing for my fellow healthcare practitioners and writing for the patient instead. What really made me do that was my daughter's book. My daughter's a dermatologist and dermatological surgeon, and she wrote a book called Skintelligent, and a book written for the patient. And I thought, my goodness, I have really never thought about doing that myself. I don't consider myself to be a writer. I'm myself Dutch, and I'm happy I speak English as good as I do, although I've lived in the States for almost 40 years. I was never very good at languages, let alone writing. Was never something that I volunteered to do, but in the 40, 50 years that I've worked in medicine, I've published about, as I said, a dozen medical texts, but I've never had the feeling that they really got the patient anywhere. So that was really kind of a top-down approach, and I really thought I need to do this different to really be able to be of service to the patient, and that is do the bottom-up approach and write a book for the patients or the broader, the lay audience in a broader sense. I have pretty much spent my entire professional career, almost 50 years, caring for patients with headache and face pain. In fact, I was fellowship trained in headache management, as it was called in those days. Now that is referred to as headache medicine. I'm not exactly sure that that's really an appropriate term, but I was trained in headache management by somebody who had spent his entire career as well treating headache patients and studying headache, John Graham, who in turn worked with Harold Wolff. Most of the scientific knowledge that we have about headache, including migraine, really comes from his fundamental work done pretty much in the first half of the last century. So I come from a very strong headache tradition. Harold Wolff, John Graham. I was John Graham's. John Graham was Harold Wolff's first assistant. I was Dr. Graham's last fellow. Over the decades that I've been involved in the care of headache and face pain patients, I've seen thousands of patients, many of whom I followed for years, if not decades. Headache is really a chronic condition that people suffer from, not just for years, but decades, often, unfortunately, an entire lifetime. And I followed patients over very long periods of time, trying to help them to the best of my abilities. And in the course of that, I have gained a lot of experience and accumulated a lot of knowledge that I really wanted to lay out for the patient, hopefully that it will provide the patient, empower the patient. I know that that word has mentioned already several times, empower the patient with knowledge that will ultimately make it possible for him or her to get the care that he or she needs. Because I think there's a lot still to be done. I see a lot of patients struggling and struggling and suffering, while in all honesty, I myself believe that we have made tremendous progress. You mentioned I have a background in pharmacology, and with that background, I have been involved in clinical trial research. I've pretty much worked on the development of all migraine medications that have come to market since the 1980s. And we have been able to develop 3 great classes of medications: triptans, gepants, CGRP antibodies, migraine-specific medications that have a high level of efficacy. And although, for example, the triptans have been around for over 30 years, I still see them underused, and when used, very often patients don't know how to properly use them, or physicians do not know how to properly prescribe them. And that really breaks my heart, so to say, because we have all these tools, and on a daily basis, as I see patients, I still see all these people suffering and suffering and suffering, and I really don't think that that is necessary. We have a lot of tools available, migraine-specific tools available that people should really rely on and not use these old-fashioned drugs anymore that are really leftovers from other therapeutic areas. That makes me very upset if I still see that happening in my patients, because the standard of care is really using migraine-specific medications, triptans, gepants, and CGRP antibodies. What I really hope for people to get out of the book is to become informed consumers. The healthcare system is unfortunately rather complicated, and I think as a patient you need to be not just knowledgeable, I think very knowledgeable nowadays to really get the care that you need and that you deserve. And I always tell patients, the care is out there, continue to look for it, don't stop until you find a solution to your problem. And that's really what is behind my book. It's really informing patients. I wanted it to be in a hardcover version because I hope that patients will take it to the doctor's offices with them and use it kind of as a guide. What is the current standard of care? Which medications should really be applied at the present time, and also how should they be used, and very importantly, what should be expected, what should patients expect from the care that they get, so that they don't get away with half measures, but that they really work with the healthcare practitioners to make sure that they get full attention for the problem, and also get there where they should be getting in terms of the relief. Headaches are terrible. Face pain, cluster headache is somewhat a form of face pain. Otherwise, we're not really talking about face pain, but face pain is also a tremendous problem. The last thing I would like to say about my book is that although I'm a neurologist, my book is not necessarily looking at it from a neurological perspective. I think it's really has a much broader perspective, a medical perspective. Dr. Graham, who I trained with, was not a neurologist, he was an internist. And I think people very often forget that there are a lot of medical issues to headache. And that's also what I talk about in my book. Chronic migraine patients also tend to have a lot of medical and psychiatric issues that come along with it. And I also deal with that in my book. Fatigue, insomnia, tight muscles in neck, shoulders, upper back, lower back, gastrointestinal issues like acid reflux, irritable bowel syndrome. I deal with all of those issues in my book, so that I think it really gives you a comprehensive, a broader view on headache and face pain than you'll find in, I think, most headache-oriented books.
Thank you so much, Dr. Spierings. It's great to have a physician's perspective. And while you say the book is not from a neurologist, a neurology point of view per se, your experience having treated so many patients and your unique experience being involved in clinical trials and pharmacology.
Psychology.
Yes. Is very insightful. I'm sure I have not read your book yet, but it is on my list. And another thing that just stood out to me as you were speaking is I think we're fortunate in the community. While there's a severe shortage of providers to treat people with migraine and headache disorders, so many of the providers, like yourself, are just so passionate and caring, and really want to try to help. There are limitations in what you can do based on the science that's available to us, but your interest in, like you were talking about, coexisting conditions, that most people with migraine are not dealing with just migraine. So I'm happy to hear that you speak to that in your book as well.
Yeah, I truly believe that. I always like to say the head is attached to the body. Headache doesn't live in a vacuum. And if you really truly want to help a patient with headache or face pain, you really need to take the entire person into account, body and mind. There's a lot of anxiety, depression that comes along with headache suffering as well. And all of that really need to be addressed. If you do not do that, you're not really creating the best treatment for your patients. So I call that wholesome medicine. People call it holistic medicine, but it's more. The treatment of a headache patient involves more than just looking at the head. Let me put it that way.
Agreed. Definitely agreed. Thank you very much. We've got our first question, but if people have other questions, you can add them into the Q&A box. You can type them into the chat, and I'll try to search through. This first question is for Joanna. It says, as someone with both diseases, I often notice cluster headache is perhaps less dismissed as a disease and almost bragged about, for lack of a better word, on how it's the worst pain ever or suicide disease, and seen as a more legitimate complaint versus just migraine. On the other hand, migraine is so much more common, so I feel that cluster patients feel less represented and more dismissed in advocacy spaces. I'm interested to hear your perspective on how the stigma of both diseases interplay amongst patient communities and how that affects care.
Thank you for that question. I am also interested in your perspective there. I wrote a chapter about that in my book, Not Tonight, where I took the position that people with cluster headache were able to draw on a much more kind of like masculinized language, kind of a brutality and violence, where people with migraine were had a very kind of feminized like withdrawal in this dark room. It was very sensitive and passive, and it worked with this idea of, hypersensitivity. I have a different, kind of like a little bit more, I think, hopefully sophisticated idea about that. Stigma it reacts differently depending on your setting. It's based on context. So it depends, I think, in what location you're in. I think if you're in a headache conference, a professional headache conference with physicians, there's some status associated with studying cluster headache because you need to have a headache center, and maybe Dr. Spierings can weigh in on this. I think you need to have a professional, you need to have a headache center in order to actually attract enough people with cluster headache to do a clinical trial, or you have to have a good relationship with cluster busters at this point. But you have like Dr. Goldsby, who has a very high status in the field, is a cluster headache specialist. So I noticed when I was in those meetings that cluster headache was spoken about with high status. But if you look at research funding on the federal level, there's almost no research funding allocated to cluster headache. So in that sense, it's like a subset of migraine. So migraine's highly stigmatized. There's this institutionalized stigma, and cluster headache really bears the burden of the stigma of migraine, which I think is partially gendered. I'm sure there are other causes as well. And then cluster headache is like, gets nothing from there. Now, I think if you're in various spaces, then you're going to experience that stigma in different ways. And I think that if you're a woman in cluster headache spaces, it might feel different as well. And it depends, I really think it's context based.
Thank you, Joanna. This next question is for Jaime. The question says, I'd be interested to hear your experience as a parent and or during pregnancy as a person living with chronic migraine, if you're willing to share. How did you navigate self-care and parenthood?
Thank you for that question. So migraine really didn't interfere with my ability to be a mother until my last pregnancy, where I experienced my first intractable migraine for my first trimester. And after that, migraine showed up very differently for me. Once I broke out of that cycle, once I got into my second trimester, when I did get a migraine attack, they were very severe. They came on very quickly, and they lasted much longer than my typical 24 hours. They would last maybe 2 or 3 days at a time. And so having 2 young children, being pregnant and going through the process of chronification was not very easy at all. And it was a very burdensome experience because trying to navigate, my pregnancy and trying to manage these debilitating migraine attacks were very hard to do. But I think what had motivated me to keep going is just something that I just learned as a kid living with migraine, is that I had to push through. Unfortunately, life wasn't going to stop because I'm dealing with a migraine attack. But what that did teach me is just how to show up as a mom the way I needed to show up despite my illness. And I think that gave me a better perspective on what's really important in life, as opposed to harping on the smaller things that really don't matter, because I don't have time to waste. Because when I do have a good day, I have to make the most of that good day. And even when I don't have a good day, what my husband and I would do with our kids when they were younger is I couldn't go to the movie theater, for example, because that was a huge set of triggers. And who doesn't like to have family movie night? And so what we would do is that we would just set up in my husband and I's bedroom, and we have the huge king size bed, and we would order takeout, and we would have what we call these bed picnics. And I talk about this in the book a little bit. And we would just rent a movie, and we would just basically navigate life around my disease and still create memories. I think that's important. When you have the right support around you, my husband is an awesome supporter and caregiver. I'm an awesome parent, awesome dad. When you have people around you that can come into your life and help you in areas where you're not able to show up fully 100% because you're not having the best day, I think that all plays a part. Having community is really important. When you're a mom with, or just a parent with chronic migraine or cluster headache, having community around you is important. And it doesn't matter how big or small that community is. When you have someone you can rely on, that's really, what you really want to focus on, is just having that 1 or 2 good people you can rely on. If you can't make dinner, or if you need someone to take the kids to their after school activities because your migraine or your head pain is just way too severe, your symptoms are too severe, that really takes the load off. And you also have to remind yourself that it's okay not to be okay. And we all want to slap that S on our chest and be super mom, super dad every day. That we're imperfect human beings, but that's what makes us, beautiful. So just with navigating motherhood and living with chronic migraine, it really is about taking it day by day. Learn how to pace yourself. When you have good days, do your prep work. If you like to prep your meals and things like that, I did that a lot as a mom when my kids were younger. Listen to your body, follow what your body needs, listen to yourself, pace yourself, and build a community around yourself to help support you through it.
Thank you, Jaime. Great insights. Lisa, what are some writing hacks for writing with migraine?
Hmm. Like, I'm guessing they mean writing through an attack.
Well, yeah,
Okay.
that's my interpretation.
Yeah. So sometimes when I have a migraine attack, I have what's called aphasia, which means it's really difficult to get words out verbally. Um, and I don't know if this is true for everyone, but I found for me, I don't have as much difficulty with the written word. Um, so, for me, what can help is the physicality of the pen on the paper. So I always kept and still keep small notebooks with me so that if I have a thought, I can write it down. And I think what really worked for me during my worst time was keeping it short. So that's why a lot of my writing about migraine is poetry. Um, you can take about a minute to write a poem, and it doesn't even have to be a good poem. Like, don't worry about if it's good or not. Just get the feelings and thoughts out. You can look at it again later when you feel well or feel at least better and see like what was going on in my brain then. And you can always change it. Don't be afraid of just getting a thought down and don't worry about how it's going to be. I'm also a sculptor. So when there's that phrase, it's not like it's set in stone. Um, like writing is so freeing because you put it in a notebook or a computer or in a note in your phone, and then you can change it.
I think another one of your writing workshops that you did that
Mhm.
I attended, you gave like a list of a couple different prompts. And I
Yeah.
remember just kind of keeping those around because I was like, it's like just somebody else asking a question
Mhm.
and then I would just like write kind of a response to your prompt. And that was a good
Oh,
way
that's so
for me
cool
to
to
like
hear.
think of something to, a way to think creatively when my brain feels very stuck.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I
Yeah.
I love that they're being used in perpetuity.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, you could always create like there's even like little journals you can get that have prompts in
Yeah.
them. It's a really good idea too.
This question, I'm gonna have Tom take this one. The question says, "You're all quite accomplished. How have you addressed the stigma and lack of understanding?"
Uh, well, that's a great question. Thanks for that. I wrote a book. No, I mean, I think everyone here is doing the exact same thing, and when they're writing these books, and that addressing the stigma is a large part of it, and whether that means, in my book, I sort of tried to drill down in an accessible way in the work of people like Joanna, who does, sort of sociological excavations that I couldn't, as a journalist, possibly accomplish. But if I can even help translate that partly for a lay audience, then I will have been doing my job. But I also think it's just, standing up and saying, I think in my introduction, I talk about hiding a lot. And I think a lot of us know what that means in the context of headache disorders. There's so much sort of ambient stigma that we navigate all the time anyway, that a lot of us are just reluctant to talk about it out loud in our daily lives. It's one thing to do it in a group like this where it's, we're all sort of going through the same thing, but kind of standing up publicly, whether it's in your workplace or whatever, and saying, this is happening, it's real, it's not in my head, and I have it too. Uh, And I think being willing to do that, I was cowardly about that through most of my career. And I struggled even with the idea of doing a book and saying, do I want to come out and tell the world that I have this thing? I mean, what it seems mad. But in fact, I don't think we get anywhere until we start doing that. So that was my motivation. I don't think that's terribly different from any other of the panelists, but I'd be happy to hear.
Yeah, does anyone else want to chime in? Yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
I'll keep it short, but um, I I am able to deal with the stigma because of all you, and by all you, I mean like everyone who's shown up here, this whole community. Before I had community, I felt I forget the word you said, Tom, but I felt much like what you're describing, just really quiet about it, and you all gave me a voice. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to take one more and then we're going to do the raffle. I'm going to summarize this question a little bit just to pare it down. But this is a person who's been living with hemiplegic migraine since they were a kid. They experimented with some psychedelics decades ago, but weren't able to find a regimen that worked for their migraines. They believe that did give them some skills for getting through their attacks and coping with living with them and learning to research medications and bio-neuro interaction as well as the psychological mind-body connection. They're wondering, this might be a Joanna or Dr. Spierings question, wondering if we know about any research looking into treating the human and not just the condition with things like art therapy, yoga, exercise, and developing coping skills, which many people figure out on their own. Or how do you even begin to quantify the research in such a qualified research-oriented world?
So, if you don't mind, I'd like to take a stab at that.
Yeah.
So, my first book, one of the things that the kind of more sociological thread through it was about the way that headache medicine had really kind of embedded itself into this neurological framework. Like this is a brain disease. We could only talk about the brain. And partly I think that was because neurologists had really, it's an interdisciplinary field, but neurologists had taken over the field. I also think it's because the brain has higher status than the mind and certainly the body. I mean, look, if pain is supposed to be biopsychosocial, I'm the sociologist and I don't see much social in there. And I think we could learn a lot by that, but that's my own soapbox. There has been all along psychological research happening. I think people would quibble with me saying this, but I do think that has been somewhat marginalized. I think there's some really interesting work happening in mindfulness meditation. And I know Miles for Migraine does sponsor some of this work, and certainly in like pain reprocessing therapy. What I wanted to say, and the reason I wanted to take this was because what I learned in the psychedelics are not for everyone. They don't treat everyone's pain. And but I think there's real promise there. I also think there's real, when we thinking about what Tom had said about how science operates, there was a decision to stop looking at serotonin receptors at a certain point. And some of the psychedelic stuff makes me think maybe that decision was wrong. Or maybe, when you look at when you start looking at CGRPs and you stop looking at serotonin receptors, you made a decision. Anyway, what I wanted to say, some of this work on psychedelics are very dirty drugs. They work on your mind, they work on your receptors, they work on neuroplasticity, and they're working on your body, and they're also working on your social relationships at the same time. And so looking at some of the other disorders it was looking at, it made me think that like if headache researchers looked at some of that work, it might be able to kind of break apart some of the Cartesian kind of like lock that the brain has on the field. I think migraine is like quite clearly a really complicated disease, right? It affects our social relationships. It makes us poorer. We know that poverty or like just any money you lose is going to affect your broader health. We know that it affects your psychology, and we know that we don't know exactly the relationship between psychology and migraine, but we know there's something going on there. And I just think that we could learn something, right? By looking at a really something that isn't, my biomedicine really likes these targeted drugs, and psychedelics are not a targeted drug. And there's something really fascinating about what's happening in that world.
Thank you, Joanna. All right, there are more questions, but I want to be respectful of people's time. Let's do the drawing, and then maybe we can do some follow-up via email. I will be sending out, it'll be tomorrow because I'm done after we log off tonight. But I will send you all links to all of these books, as well as some of the events that we spoke about on the call tonight. I realized you may not have been able to copy from the chat, so we'll send all of that information to you. But let's go ahead and pick some names for the books. We're going to start with Lisa's book, Dear Migraine, and that is going to go to Mona Pan. And I would ask, if I call out your name, if you can send an email to me, katie@milesformigraine.org, just confirming your address. We will mail these books to you. And I'm just making a note so I remember who got each book. All right, next we're going to do Jaime's book, More Than Migraine. That is going to go to Joyce Manecki. All right, and then we're going to do Psychedelic Outlaws. That is going to go to Emily Kavanaugh. And then we're going to do Headaches. That is going to go to Lucy Michael. And then Tom's book, Headache, is going to go to Sally Brockman. All right. So that is it for tonight. Thank you again to our panelists for taking the time to come speak about your work. Actually, taking a step back, thank you for taking the time to write your books. It's really important for our community and those beyond our community to understand more about this disease. And I really do feel like we're making a lot of progress and raising awareness in the community, and each of you are a big part of that. And thank you to everyone who came tonight to participate and listen to our speakers. I hope you maybe are inspired to pick up one of these books and learn more about migraine. And we welcome all of you to come join another Miles for Migraine event with us soon. Like I said, I'll send out some links afterwards with some of our upcoming events and a post-event survey. But thank you all so much for being here. Have a great night.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.